The marble steps of the federal courthouse gleamed under the first light of dawn. Inside, tensions were already running high, with only minutes left before the trial commenced. The courtroom was packed, defendants uncertain of their fate, attorneys preparing their arguments, and spectators eager to witness justice unfold. However, the man who drew the most attention was the one striding toward the bench, Judge Howard Garrison. For years, Judge Garrison had been known as one of the toughest figures in the legal system. Though he tried to maintain an image of fairness, his harsh sentences against conservative defendants and his erratic behavior were becoming impossible to ignore. Today, however, the stakes were even higher. Vice President JD Vance was set to testify in court. Garrison was in a foul mood as he entered the courtroom that morning. The moment he stepped through the doors, his voice thundered across the room. "There will be no coffee in my courtroom, and if the defense attorney is not here in 2 minutes, I will hold him in contempt immediately." The court clerk flinched, visibly shaken. Everyone who knew Garrison understood how unpredictable he could be when agitated, but today he seemed more aggressive than ever. Just then, a court officer approached and whispered, "Your Honor, Vice President Vance has arrived." For a split second, Garrison's expression tensed, but he quickly composed himself. His eyes narrowed as a mocking smirk crept across his face. "How delightful," he sneered. "Tell him that titles mean nothing in my courtroom. He may be the vice president, but here he is just another witness." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as JD Vance entered with deliberate steps. His deep navy suit was immaculate, his face carrying an air of composed seriousness. He paused in the center of the room, scanning the crowd. His supporters nodded quietly, while his opponents clenched their jaws. Garrison studied Vance intently before slamming his gavel down forcefully. "Let me remind you all," he said, deepening his tone for authority, "in this courtroom, I am the law." Vance gave a slight nod. "Of course, Your Honor. I am here because I believe in justice being served fairly." "Justice?" Garrison let out a dry chuckle. "We'll see about that. I decide what fairness looks like." A tense silence settled over the courtroom. Many had long suspected Garrison's bias, but hearing him declare it so openly was shocking. At the center of the trial was philanthropist Raymond Caldwell and his foundation, the Jefferson Foundation. The foundation had been accused of acting as a front for illegal funds, but the defense had substantial evidence proving the contrary, evidence that rested largely on the documents JD Vance was prepared to present. But Garrison's intentions were clear: discredit Vance, convict Caldwell, and dismantle the Jefferson Foundation. As the proceedings began, the judge's bias became glaringly obvious. When the defense attorney attempted to introduce documents proving the foundation's legitimate charitable activities, Garrison cut him off immediately. "Irrelevant! Move on!" The attorney pressed on carefully. "Your Honor, these documents establish my client's innocence." "I don't care. Inadmissible." Garrison's gavel slammed down. "Next question." The air in the courtroom grew heavier as the moment approached for JD Vance to take the stand. No matter what, he was determined to present his evidence. But what no one knew was that Judge Garrison had his own secrets to hide, and soon everything was about to spiral out of control. The tension in the courtroom had reached an unbearable level. Judge Howard Garrison was carefully watching for an opportunity to corner JD Vance, while the defense team proceeded with caution. When the court clerk called Vance's name to testify, a deep silence settled over the room. JD Vance walked toward the witness stand, his shoulders squared, his expression unreadable, but his eyes burned with determination. A court officer stepped forward, holding out a Bible. "Place your hand on the Bible and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." Without hesitation, Vance took the oath and then locked eyes directly with Judge Garrison. The defense attorney spoke first. Mr. Vance, can you share with us what you know about Raymond Caldwell and the Jefferson Foundation? Vance was ready to reveal the truth. The Jefferson Foundation had donated millions of dollars to those in need, funding educational programs and social welfare initiatives. However, in recent months, the organization had been the subject of speculative accusations whose origins remained a mystery. Just as Vance was about to begin, Judge Garrison raised his hand and cut him off. Mr. Vance, there's no need for long explanations. Just answer this clearly. Do you admit that the Jefferson Foundation has been laundering money illegally? A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Even the defense team was caught off guard. The judge's words were blatantly accusatory, something no truly impartial judge would ever say. Vance frowned. Your Honor, that is an assumption. I am here to present the facts. Garrison leaned back in his chair and let out a condescending chuckle. Facts? Well then, tell us, why are the Jefferson Foundation's financial records so convoluted? Which dirty money went into which accounts? Vance simply shook his head. I would be happy to explain. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder, placing the documents on the witness stand. Here are the complete financial records of the Jefferson Foundation for the past 5 years, audited by independent investigators, fully transparent and entirely legal. The defense attorney immediately intervened. Your Honor, these documents prove my client's innocence. We request they be entered into the official record. But Garrison didn't even glance at the documents before barking, Denied! The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The defense attorney, visibly baffled, asked, But why, Your Honor? These are legitimate records. Garrison's face hardened. Because I said so. This courtroom is under my control, and I have no intention of listening to baseless defenses. At that moment, everything became clear. Garrison's bias wasn't just personal, it was deliberate. He had something to gain from this case. A knowing smirk appeared on JD Vance's face. The judge's panic was revealing. He was hiding something big. Vance took a deep breath. Your Honor, something has caught my attention. Garrison's eyes narrowed. And what might that be? You are the only one in this courtroom relentlessly accusing the Jefferson Foundation. But your job is to be an impartial judge. That made me wonder, why? Garrison shifted slightly in his seat. This is my courtroom, Vance. You don't get to question me. Vance nodded slowly. Of course, but I do have the right to present evidence. With that, he pulled out a second folder from his briefcase. This contains bank records from the anonymous accounts that filed complaints against the Jefferson Foundation. Garrison's face turned pale. Vance opened the documents and began reading aloud. This is quite interesting. Your Honor, you might recognize these accounts. They were opened in the Cayman Islands, and curiously enough, payments from these accounts have been made directly in your name at regular intervals. A shockwave rippled through the courtroom. Garrison shot to his feet. Enough! I will not tolerate such absurd accusations in my courtroom. Vance calmly handed the documents to the defense team. This is not an accusation, Your Honor. This is evidence. Journalists scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, and even the court officials couldn't tear their eyes away from the judge. Garrison's hands trembled slightly, but trying to mask his fear, he leaned forward and growled, If you think you can set me up with fake documents, you're sorely mistaken. You cannot silence me. But just then, the courtroom doors swung open. FBI agents flooded into the room. Chaos erupted. One of the leading agents walked straight to the court clerk and announced in a loud, clear voice, As of this moment, this courtroom is under federal investigation. Judge Howard Garrison, remain where you are. Garrison's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. This is impossible. Vance, moving at an unhurried pace, placed the last of his documents on the table and simply nodded. Justice, Your Honor. It comes sooner or later. Garrison tried to move, but the FBI agents seized him instantly. A deep silence settled over the room, and in that silence everyone had seen firsthand how justice had been twisted in the wrong hands. But this was only the beginning, because the documents Vance had just exposed didn't just incriminate a single judge, they threatened an entire corrupt system, and JD Vance had no intention of stopping now. Judge Howard Garrison was tightly restrained by FBI agents while the entire courtroom held its breath. He thrashed in panic, desperately searching for an escape. But there was none. "Let me go!" he shouted as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "This is a setup, a White House conspiracy, JD Vance's political games." One of the FBI agents turned to him with a cold, emotionless stare. "Oh, really?" he asked. "Then how do you explain these transactions?" The agent placed a thick folder in the center of the courtroom. At that moment, every eye in the room fixated on the documents. Throughout the case against the Jefferson Foundation, secret payments had been flowing into Garrison's offshore accounts, and these payments always coincided with his rulings against prominent conservative figures. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Lawyers, journalists, and observers whispered amongst themselves, scanning the damning evidence. JD Vance turned to Garrison, his voice calm but firm. "I think we now see who was truly biased in this case." But Garrison wasn't done fighting. His face turned red with fury. "You can't do this. I am still a judge. My rulings stand in this court." One of the FBI agents stepped forward, pulling out a sealed document. His voice was devoid of emotion as he read aloud. "No, Mr. Garrison, you are no longer a judge. As of this moment, this courtroom is under federal jurisdiction." The agent handed a file to the court clerk. "By order of the Attorney General, Judge Garrison has been officially removed from office and is under arrest for bribery, abuse of power, and judicial corruption." The words hit the room like a bomb. Garrison's composure completely shattered. He lurched forward in defiance. "You can't just throw me away like this. I'm not some nobody. If I talk, a lot of people are going down with me." The FBI agent merely nodded. "Then I suggest you start talking." Journalists scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and even jury members exchanged stunned glances. This wasn't just about one corrupt judge. This was the unraveling of a system-wide conspiracy. JD Vance stepped closer to Garrison, locking eyes with the disgraced judge. "For years, people like you have abused power for personal gain. But this time, the public is watching. It's time to remember who justice truly belongs to." Garrison sneered through clenched teeth. "You think you've won? I'm just a small piece. If you keep digging, you'll go up against people you can't touch." JD Vance smirked. "If the system is rotten, we don't patch it up, we tear it down and rebuild. This is only the beginning." With Garrison's arrest, the case against the Jefferson Foundation collapsed almost instantly. But that was just the surface. The FBI began a deeper investigation into the documents revealed in court. What they uncovered was far worse than expected. This wasn't just one corrupt judge. This was an entire network of judicial manipulation that extended to the highest levels of power. Prosecutors started investigating other federal judges and officials. When offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were examined, the findings were explosive. Not just Garrison, but 7 other high-ranking federal judges had been receiving similar payments. This wasn't just corruption. This was a deliberate strategy, a systematic weaponization of the courts to silence political opposition. Their main target? Conservative figures and organizations that challenged the status quo. Now, the entire house of cards was starting to collapse. JD Vance was monitoring everything closely. One evening, while sitting in his office at the White House, his chief of staff entered, holding a confidential report. "Mr. Vice President, the FBI has sent an update. Garrison has started talking." Vance took the file, flipping through the pages. Garrison had confessed everything. The bribery network, the cases they rigged, and the people who were threatened into silence. But the biggest shock was the name at the top of the list. Vance's expression hardened. One name had been circled in red ink, the mastermind behind it all. He exhaled sharply. This can't be real. But the documents were undeniable. The corruption went all the way to the highest seat of power, and JD Vance knew one thing for certain. This war wasn't over. It was just getting started. Howard Garrison's arrest had sent shockwaves through the nation, but this was only the beginning. The FBI's findings exposed a deep rot within the American judicial system. The ongoing investigations proved that corruption wasn't limited to a single judge. It infected the entire system. Sitting in his White House office, JD Vance carefully reviewed the confidential files. The names of high-profile judges and bureaucrats filled the pages. But one name stood out, one that sent a chill down his spine. James Whitaker, Chief Justice of the U.S. Court of Appeals. He was one of the most powerful figures in American law, respected, independent, and neutral. But the documents painted a different picture. Whitaker had been using the judicial system as a weapon. Vance exhaled slowly. If we expose this, the country will be shaken to its core. But if we don't, the corruption continues. Just then, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. His chief of staff entered with a grave expression. "Mr. Vice President, Whitaker wants to meet you. In private." Vance's eyes narrowed. "Me?" "Yes, sir. Not a phone call. Face to face." The meeting took place in one of Washington, D.C.'s most exclusive private clubs. When Vance arrived, Whitaker was already seated, waiting. The Chief Justice looked as calm and composed as ever. His perfectly tailored suit and immaculate hair gave him the air of a man who had seen decades of power. But there was something lurking beneath his eyes, a quiet but unmistakable threat. Vance took a seat across from him. Whitaker smiled slightly. "Vice President Vance, it's good to see you. Let's be honest. Things have gotten out of hand." Vance wasted no time. "You know why we're here." Whitaker sighed and nodded. "Ah, yes, Garrison and his little confessions. You know how people panic and say ridiculous things." Vance placed the classified documents on the table. "These aren't just words. These are records. Payments, case manipulations, judicial bribery. All of it leads back to you." Whitaker glanced at the papers, then leaned back with an amused smile. "These prove nothing, Mr. Vice President. But even if they did, do you really think you can win this fight?" Whitaker folded his hands and continued, his tone shifting from casual to calculating. "I lead the most powerful court in this country. If you release these documents, the public loses faith. Chaos follows. The justice system collapses. Is that really what you want?" Vance's expression remained stone cold. "What I want is justice." Whitaker chuckled, shaking his head. "Justice? Let me explain how the real world works." He tapped his fingers on the table as he listed out his plan. 1. The media will spin this, claiming corruption exists on both sides, confusing the public. 2. Trust in the courts will erode, and people will lose faith in the system. 3. The president and you will be blamed for the crisis. 4. Your political career will be over. And most importantly, Whitaker leaned in closer, lowering his voice. 5. The people who back you, the ones who truly hold power, will abandon you. Vance didn't flinch. "Are you threatening me?" Whitaker shook his head, smiling. "Not at all. Just stating the facts. If you stay silent, everyone wins. If you move forward, we all lose." Back at the White House, JD Vance sat at his desk, staring at the documents. Whitaker's words echoed in his mind. If you stay silent, everyone wins. But who was really winning? The people or the corrupt elite? His phone rang. It was Raymond Caldwell. Vance, you all right? I heard about the meeting. Whitaker, he's trying to silence us, Vance replied. If we expose this, the entire system could collapse. But if we don't, nothing changes. Raymond took a deep breath. This corruption has gone on for decades. If someone doesn't stop it now, it will last forever. Vance hesitated. But what about the country? If this blows up, won't it destroy faith in our institutions? Raymond's response was firm. If the system is rotten, let it collapse. Only then can we build something better. Vance's grip tightened around the phone. His mind was made up. 2 days later, the White House held a historic press conference. Standing at the podium, JD Vance addressed millions of Americans watching live. Today, we fulfill our duty to the American people. Corruption in the judiciary is no longer a secret. It is a fact. And we will not turn a blind eye. The classified documents were presented publicly. Whitaker and several high-ranking judges were placed under federal investigation. The public's outrage was immediate, but many were grateful that the truth had finally been exposed. Within days, Whitaker resigned. Federal courts began sweeping reforms. After the press conference, Raymond Caldwell approached Vance. That was a hell of a risk. Vance smiled. Sometimes, justice demands the biggest risks. That night, as Vance stood on the White House balcony gazing at Washington, D.C., he knew a battle had been won. But the war was far from over, because the fight for justice requires courage, persistence, and an unbreakable will. And J.D. Vance was ready to see it through to the very end.